the language of the brain, those electrical potentials that are destined to generate the action happened in the past. And the computer can detect that. And when we can't make that action, the computer, through manifestation of hardware, robotics, speakers like the audio equipment we have in this room, can then make that action that the human wants to make in the real world. And that's the potential of BCI, of what we're trying to do.
What if there were tools that could tell us what the brain is trying to say? Today, we're exploring brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs. This technology has the potential to transform lives, from empowering people with disabilities to developing future devices that respond to our very thoughts. That's ahead on this episode of Tomorrow's Cure, a podcast from Mayo Clinic that brings the future of medicine to the present. I'm Kathy Wurzer. Thanks for being with us. Today, we're speaking with two experts working to connect brains to machines. Dr. Jonathan Parker is with us. He's an epilepsy and functional neurosurgeon. He's also the director of the Device-Based Neuroelectronics Research Lab and an assistant professor of neurosurgery and neuroscience at Mayo Clinic. Also joining us is Dr. Alan Waziri. He's a neuroscientist and neurosurgeon, and he's the CEO and co-founder of ICE Neurosystems. That's a neurotech startup that's developing the technology to revolutionize brain care in the critically ill. Dr. Parker, Dr. Waziri, it's so great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Kathy, for having us here today.
I was reading a lot about BCIs to get ready for a conversation, gentlemen, and one person working in the field says it's like a USB port for your brain. I don't know what you think about that description, but how do you describe it, Dr. Waziri?
That's, I guess, one way of describing it. Functionally, our brain is hardware, and this has been the longstanding interest in BCI is how do we interface the tissue, which is our hardware, with the computer or the stimulator or whatever else may be plugging into the brain somehow. But I think that's where that concept of the USB to the brain, what we work on is what's the port, right? And then the data transfer and those kinds of things.
So we're talking about BCI allowing people to control machines with their thoughts, right? How do you explain that to people, Dr. Parker?
Yeah, so I think it's a tremendously exciting technology. And I think it's important to take a few steps back. Last year was the 100-year anniversary of EEG, right? And EEG, the electrical activity of the brain, is sort of it's the ones and zeros, right, of human thought, human interaction. As Alan mentioned earlier, this is an input-output issue. Brain is a piece of hardware. Brain-computer interface is another piece of hardware we're connecting to the brain. We're used to communicating through speech, movement, understanding, other sensory inputs, right? So this is really talking about how do we digitize those inputs and read and write those out of the brain to try to solve a problem, right? From the 60s, we've had these human-machine interfaces to do simple things like advanced slides on a old-fashioned circular slide deck. And right now, we're focusing on making brain-computer interfaces largely to help people that have had devastating neurologic injuries that affect their speech or affect their ability to move. But there's whole other classes of ways that we could use this interfacing technology to treat human disease.
And the technology, can you explain, Dr. Waziri, how does this all manifest in the brain?
Yeah, so our brains basically generate a biological version of electricity. That's the way that the neurons, the networks, all of the ultrastructure that is our hardware communicates with itself is not true light speed electricity, but it's a biological version of that. And in the same way that we can detect EKG, the little lines that we all see, EEG is the same thing that spins off the brain all the time.
Say, could you, for listeners, by the way, EEG, could you explain that?
So the EEG stands for electroencephalography, and many of those patterns are very common from person to person. In the same way that we have a baseline heart rate, people can have a relatively similar baseline EEG. And then in pathological conditions, if somebody has a stroke or has a brain injury of some sort, those EEG patterns can be altered in the same way that the EKG is changed if somebody has a heart attack. But our EEG patterns also change associated with what we're doing. If we're moving, if we're seeing, if we're thinking, if we're hearing, if we're speaking. And, this has been a major focus of the work in BCI for several decades, is that translation of those electrical potentials that are coming off of the brain into something that we can understand on a computer side that will then functionalize whatever device, a robotic arm, a cursor on a screen, drive a wheelchair, so on and so forth.
You said something that sparked a thought in my head of how to think about this is that one of the things it's not always evident to us, we're speaking right now, but inside that brain, that language that Alan was talking about milliseconds before, the brain was doing something to get to that endpoint. So there's almost this lagging indicator of reality is behind when actually the brain initiated that thought or that action. And that's the underpinning of BCI, at least speech BCI and motor BCI, is that the language of the brain, those electrical potentials that are destined to generate the action in the real world, happened in the past. And the computer can detect that. And when we can't make that action, articulate a vowel, move our hand, the computer, through manifestation of hardware, robotics, speakers like the audio equipment we have in this room, can then make that action that the human wants to make in the real world. And that's the potential of BCI, what we're trying to do. And now we have companies that are stitching electrodes into the brain or putting electrodes into the blood vessels of the brain to do very high dimensional control of things like motor and speech. But there's a great potential for just simple brain computer interfaces to do things like move a wheelchair or click on a computer, or whole classes of simple devices, diagnostic brain computer interfaces to track and monitor the brain health over time. And that's personally what I'm most passionate about. Complex BCI for motor and speech, tremendously impactful for people with spinal cord injury, ALS, which is a progressive neurologic condition. But this type of technology, this type of approach, when delivered to clinicians simply so they can just monitor the brain signals over time, could have tremendous impact for epilepsy, depression, Alzheimer's, these conditions which are affecting huge swaths of our population. And that's the future of this technology I'm very excited about.
Yeah, I think that's JP spot on. And going back a little bit to what he was mentioning in terms of how our speech function works, we are very different from AI, if you will, in that we have a very integrated, unified, complicated input-output system with a fantastic external hardware element, which, we're building humanoid robots in parallel to AI, but, we're kind of trying to duplicate those human functions, which have evolved over, hundreds of millions of years. But it's not a simple process. What goes into that is that we first of all think about what we want to say, and then that kind of bounces to a different part of the brain that's involved with the motor aspect of speech. We think about there's multiple layers on that. And I think that's where JP is going a bit with all of the various opportunities for intervention in terms of neurological disease, is that in any of those cases where some component of that network is disrupted, you may lose downstream functions. And so humans can, to some extent, rewire. People who are younger, people whose brains are in better shape, they're much more likely to be able to recover from a neurological injury because there are certain things where we can use auxiliary systems. But I think to JP's point, there's probably many different versions of these where you can plug into different elements of the kind of neurological function to augment that with an external agent.
So in a sense, it goes around, the BCIs go around the damaged area.
That's right.
If you're dealing with, say, a stroke patient, or as you said, Dr. Parker, someone who has ALS.
It's trying to go around that damaged connection. Oftentimes, it may be a stroke that affects the cables, right? The white matter of the brain, which is the communication part that's connecting the thinking part of the brain, which is generally speaking, we think the gray matter or the neurons. I think the other important thing to think about when we think that's this technology and how it can affect patients is that as it stands now, a lot of what we are calling brain-computer interface and what we see in the news of companies that are now working to get this through clinical trials and commercialize it is invasive brain-computer interface. It still requires us, unfortunately, to stitch wires into the brain or to fish a catheter backwards up through the groin, up over the aortic arch into the vessel that feeds the brain, or sometimes on the venous side, put it into a vein in the brain. And these things are still invasive procedures, and where Mayo Clinic, we always like to focus on the needs of the patient come first. Nobody really wants to have these invasive procedures that have risk. So it may be a little bit ironic coming from a pair of neurosurgeons, but I think we need to focus on how do we make this technology so we can do it non-invasively. Things like implants that are underneath the scalp or on the top of the scalp, ways that we can use this technology to do simpler things that have huge public health impact, that we can get into the clinic sooner rather than later, and have just less risk to our patient. I think that's the future that all of us want, and that's certainly what we're working towards.
I'm wondering about the implantable devices. I bet there are probably some limitations with that technology, right?
Yeah, and I think to JP's point, I was involved really early on during my training with some of the preliminary versions of brain machine interface and these, kind of brain defibrillators for epilepsy. And after you do enough neurosurgery, you realize we really shouldn't be going inside the head unless you really have to, because there is going to be risk with that. I think the reason why the field went in that direction is that we had this idea that we need to record down to the single neuron layer, which means that we have to put a very, very small needle directly into the brain so it can record from a single neuron. The challenge with traditional kind of scalp-based electrodes is that it's a biocompatibility problem. Unlike EKG, where the electrical potentials are very large because there's uniformity and they're fairly simple, EEG is several orders of magnitude more complicated than EKG. And the signal has to get out of the brain, has to get through the skull, has to get through the scalp. And so not only are the signals smaller and they're kind of more denser in terms of their information, but we just have more noise. And if you're getting a very noisy signal and you need to use that for a diagnostic purpose, it's not usable in many cases. And what we've seen over and over again is that scalp-based EEG electrodes, they require trained technicians, it's cumbersome, but the data quality just isn't very good. And counterpoint, long time ago, we started placing electrodes through a little hole that we would make in the skull at the bedside in critically ill patients. That significantly improved the signal quality. And every time we drill a hole in somebody's head, there is a risk that we cause some bleeding or some injury to the brain. They can get an infection. So we kind of picked the middle ground, which is if you place something below the surface of the skin, it's like placing an IV. We get IVs all the time. A needle goes in, the device goes in, the needle comes out. But you don't really need, in that case, a trained expert. It takes just a few minutes to place the electrode. But what we really get is something that can provide us long-term, high-quality data, which is ultimately what we need for all of the really amazing things that we can do with that data.
When we record something from the brain and you provide that information, let's say it's about a brain state or a state of a brain disease like Alzheimer's, and you provide that information to the patient and to the clinician, it means different things. If we had an EEG-based biomarker, we could track over weeks, months, and years to say, yeah, this medication is working, keep going. This is the change that we expect to see. People think differently about the disease process, right? One of the things that I've learned over the years of taking care of patients with neurologic disorders, I think it goes for a lot of medicine, fear of the unknown. Where is this headed? We sort of all have that question in life, right? But where is this disease headed? Is it getting worse more quickly? Is what I'm doing helping? Clinicians always want to know that, but patients want to know that too. And they want to understand, how their brain is functioning in what the future holds. So I think it sounds sort of sci-fi to think about, but we have the science, right? We know those biomarkers from these episodic measurements we get from the sticky electrodes, if you will, on the head every month or every couple of months. But we don't have the ability to provide clinicians and importantly provide patients that more dense brain data to tell them how their brain health is doing, how their disease state is doing, if they're responding to medications. And that's what I think we need to be working towards.
I couldn't agree more. There's a great company in Boston that has been doing that kind of work, where if you've got a patient that's on an experimental drug in a trial, clinical trials are very hard to perform if you're looking for just the clinical outcome, particularly in the kind of neurological space where our tests are oftentimes very subjective. We talk to the patient, we have them do a variety of tasks, but this company developed a way of looking at EEG patterns as the patient was receiving the drug. And even if the patient doesn't start to manifest clinical benefit, they can start to see the EEG patterns improving. So, in that case, even if you're not seeing a clinical benefit immediately, it says, keep giving the drug. We might get some benefit. Let's keep going. JP mentioned Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, obviously, we've got a lot of experience with, but really having a more concrete biomarker of response to therapy that doesn't rely on our antiquated neurological exam is so important, not just for the physicians to understand if their treatment is working, but for the patient to feel like what they're doing is worth it.
It sounds like there are some exciting things to do when it comes to BCIs, right? And I'm wondering how they could transform people's lives. And I bring this up because I saw a beautiful video online of a person with ALS who lost the ability to speak. And he was part of a research project dealing with BCIs. And just his face lit up when he was attempting to talk and the computer understood what he was saying, right? And it popped up on the screen. And his whole face just lit up and he started to cry because he was finally understood. And I'm wondering if BCIs are decoding what that patient wants to say, isn't it reading that individual's thoughts? And what of that?
You're right. At its crux, those sorts of brain-computer interfaces you're talking about are listening to thought, which in certain circumstances, that patient then wants to turn that thought into an action. And it is listening to thought. But I think there's a lot of worry in the press about, well, you're getting a scalp EEG and someone steals your scalp EEG data. Are they going to understand your deepest thoughts or et cetera? And that's simply not the case. But there is a level of abstraction in density to what most of the brain-computer interface that Alan and I are talking about, which won't allow you to get down to granular levels of thought. But things like you're alluding to for ALS and work that the BCI companies are doing right now is getting closer to that point. So I do think it is something we have to think about as we move forward as a group doing this research, as a society. We will get to the point where we have that granularity of understanding thought before initiation, right? Before it becomes action. And that's a slippery slope, right? What if you have a bad thought, right? Or you intend to do a bad action in a dystopian environment? Conceptually, you might want to intervene upon that, right? And block a bad thought from turning into a bad action. I don't think we're probably ready for that as a society yet. And that shouldn't be the focus of BCI development, as we have this theme of public health and making impactful, simple BCIs. But this is something we're going to have to deal with as a society. And as large language models and machine learning integrates into every facet of our society, if it's reviewing our thoughts all the time, that could be a concerning eventuality.
What do you think about mental privacy, Dr. Waziri?
Our minds are already getting read because the patterns of our outputs, where we travel, right? Our phones are tracking where we are, which websites you go to, what are you looking up? Who are you spending time with, right? That is a reflection of what we're thinking or what we are doing at that moment in time. And if you collect up enough of that data, you can start to really predict what people are going to do and what they're thinking and what they're worrying about that day. And then if you start to look at patterns of human behavior, then you can start to categorize people that if they're looking at this and they're in that setting and they've been there 5 times this week, well, we've seen 15 other people that do the same thing. And in that case, they're thinking this, right? So the mind reading is already occurring by the companies that we funnel our data to, willingly or unwillingly. I don't think we have to necessarily plug in and pull EEG off of individual neurons to be able to do that.
Do you see the importance of addressing some of these ethical concerns in advance or too early?
I frankly worry about amounts too that can happen in BCI, right? The first time that God forbid there's a complication, right, with that hits the public press about a BCI or an infection or an injury to the brain, that could really set the field back. It would maybe inappropriate fear, right? Because we know these things can happen and they're rare, but it will certainly get magnified. The first time that there is an augmentative brain-computer interface sort of done outside the traditional system, and that gets in the popular press, there could be a large amount of fear around that, right? the further segregation of the have and have not, the mentally augmented and the mentally non-augmented, right? What does that mean for your competitiveness for jobs in an increasingly challenging world where everyone's wanting to differentiate themselves? I think getting Kathy to your point of how do we upstream deal with some of those issues as a society, I think there's always that fine line of over regulating an industry in slowing down innovation, but putting appropriate guardrails. I think institutions play a role. For instance, Mayo Clinic, I think we're appropriately focused on BCIs to treat diseases first and foremost, to try to help people that have speech issues or motor issues or these other large disorders like stroke and Alzheimer's and epilepsy. That's our focus because that's the here and now. And I think we play a part of role of driving that direction of the field and in putting out good principles of how to do sound research, how to be pragmatic though about what actually can get done and what actually can get to the clinic and what actually can get paid for in the current healthcare system. So I think we have to be good role models in that point of view. But I think getting more of this in the public discourse is a good thing. So we can start to see what direction society wants to take it. That's going to drive where this technology can go.
One of the things that we're doing with BCI is we're fundamentally, in some weird way, making cyborgs, right? It's a mix between a human, a biological element, and a machine, which is a non-biological element. And by definition, those two things have to live in synchrony. But, if there's a natural process of where we continue to augment various things, yes, right now we're focusing really on specific disease-related processes. But there's going to be some element of moving farther and farther away from that. But when do we start to get towards augmentation? Can you turn your cell phone on? Can you change the channel? What would it take for somebody who doesn't have a brain problem to get a device implanted that then becomes part of their everyday life? Right now, we have wearables that will do various things like that. But what is the inflection point? When do we cross that line to when we've got human augmentation rather than disease repair or disease optimization? So we spent a lot of time talking about this. If you make an exoskeleton that could theoretically be controlled by a BCI for somebody who's had a stroke. So in that case, yes, you need to replace their physical function. But what does it mean if you make an exoskeleton that has super strength and super speed and you're using the same technology in a normal person just to give them superhuman abilities because the underlying technology is the same between them and a patient that had a stroke? They get the same suit. You juice up the suit can do all kinds of amazing things. In the same way that we worry about where AI is going to go, I think on some level, we want to figure out where is this cyborg element of brain-computer interface going to go. We think about this from the BCI neurosurgeon's perspective is, what would it take for you to do a surgery on a normal person?
And should we allow that, right? Like, what if it becomes safe enough where the risks are acceptably minimal? Should we put societal resources towards that? Should you be allowed to do that? But it's going to happen, I think, slowly, but it's sort of like that convergence analogy. Access to information is getting closer and closer to the brain. It's just a matter of time before it gets to physical connection with the brain, right? We have these examples. We've talked about it all hour. The physical connection to the brain has been going on for years, and certainly in the popular press of these high dimensional interfaces in the last 2 to 3 years. But that's still a long ways off from every patient getting that. And I don't know if the right future is invasive augmentation, but it's interesting to see how things unfold.
I think the other thing that is cool to explore is like, what is it that makes us human that we need to replace? So, being able to move around, that's largely a convenience thing and a cost thing. And like, there's certain activities that you can't do, but for people that can't speak, or even worse, can't understand language, or bringing people back into the human community with technology. And I think this is all just different flavors of that.
Right.
If somebody has a tremor, so they can't really do the basic things of life, and when that tremor goes away and they can go to a restaurant and have a cup of coffee,
Right. Amazing.
And that's very well borne out in survey studies that have been done in spinal cord injury and in ALS patients. It's the loss of autonomy and agency in the communication. Sometimes it's rated higher than the motor. I think it's speaking to, because that's even more at a fundamental ground truth. What it means to be human is the ability to interact with another human.
And you've touched on it a little bit. What does it mean for the species that we're connecting our brains to machines?
So much of when we get new technology now, let's say consumer technology or self, like we expect to turn it on, to boot it up and use the app, and it works. When we get in our car, we take it for granted that the brake will work. The when we go right on the wheel on the steering wheel, the wheels will also go right. We go left, it goes left. BCI, especially where we are now, and something that's not always talked about or intuitive, when we turn on novel new BCIs, especially these complicated systems with wires in the brain, it takes time for these systems to learn the brain. That's getting quicker, but they still have to learn how the human brain works. And they still need time to train and to learn. And that's something I think it's important to understand about BCI, is that it's not necessarily a plug and play, that there is still a learning period where it's understanding variabilities between humans, between individuals, between where these electrodes may be on or in the brain, and how they function. So this is something that is still an advancing field and advancing art. It is one of the things that we need to address and to make that quicker before this is going to have tremendous widespread impact.
It's just like anything else. You have to learn how to use it. And so instead of moving in a particular way, you may have to think in a particular way. So there's a famous, very cool experiment that was done by one of our colleagues in a kid who had electrodes placed for epilepsy monitoring. So electrodes, we do a surgery, we put the electrodes on the brain, and then the kid comes back and we have them there for a couple of weeks, we record seizures. But in that case where the electrode is sitting on the brain, let's just see if we can gather some information. So this neurosurgeon and his team basically trained the kid to play Space Invaders with his mind over the course of the week that he was in the hospital. So, you start off with a joystick, and then you take the joystick away, and you can still move the ship and hit the fire button with just really, really simple processing. But I guarantee if he was just asking that kid to learn how to move a cursor around, it would not have gone that fast. It kind of reminds me of a very different version of this, but it's something that we all see as junior neurosurgery residents, and it's kind of a powerful case to see. For example, JP, if you do a deep brain stimulator for a patient with essential tremor, we've all seen these videos where patient's in the head frame and we're in the operating room and we drop the electrode down to the target. And the first time you turn the stimulator on and their tremor goes away without them doing anything, right? It's this really profound moment.
That was tremendously impactful for me. I remember the first day of medical school neurology coursework. A neurosurgeon was one of our professors and brought in a patient who had Parkinson's disease and turned off their DBS, and they started to have their tremor. A minute later, turned it back on, and as Alan described, tremor melting away. That was tremendously impactful on my decision to pursue this field of neurosurgery and brain-computer interfacing. We're still even trying to get that therapy delivered to patients, let alone these highly complex brain-computer interfaces. These sort of low-dimensional therapeutic brain-computer interfaces, we're still working on trying to make those safer and more effective and getting patients more comfortable with that. But again, it gets back to talking with patients about what do they want. That nobody really wants two electrodes in their head, right? Nobody really wants to undergo that. I know, Alan knows, how others know how impactful in amazing that therapy can be. And we've made great strides in doing it very, very safely. I do that surgery all the time, and we have great results. But is there a way we can do it better? Is there a way we can do it from outside of the brain? And that's the promise of brain-computer interface, is things that are getting outside the brain, less invasive, and more nuanced abilities to read those electrical fields coming off the brain, to do things that can move the needle to make our care for patients better.
Both of you have worked in this field now, and I'm wondering, what are the things that you have seen in your research where you say to yourself, wow, this is really going to be something in the next even 5-10 years?
I direct the device-based neuroelectronic labs at Mayo. We focused on epilepsy in stimulating the brain to prevent seizures. We're really advancing in our knowledge to understand what the risk state of a seizure is and try to understand what might be the best way to stimulate the brain to lower the risk of a patient having a seizure. We've made great strides in coming up with biomarkers or electrical thumbprints, if you will, of when that therapy might be working. Current standard of care is we try one setting, we wait 3 months, we ask the patients, are you having more or less seizures? But we don't have objective readouts. What I want to know is 5 minutes later, is that the right pattern, right? Because if it's not, I'm moving on. I'm trying the next thing. There's been great strides in trying to connect up brain computer interfaces to spinal cord stimulators to not just run a robot, but actually reactivate in sort of do an end run, as Alan alluded to earlier, around spinal cord injury, right? And reactivate a patient's native musculature so they can walk natively, not necessarily have to use an exoskeleton. We still have a long ways to go in Parkinson's disease and this problem with Parkinson's disease where we freeze up and we stop walking and we fall. Tremendously impactful. Falls in the elderly cause a lot of problems, fractures, a lot of lost quality of life. In DBS can't fix freezing of gait, and there's a lot of smart folks that are working on that. Some breakthroughs in the last year or two in coupling deep brain stimulation with spinal cord stimulation, so the folks with Parkinson's disease don't have to freeze. They can walk fluidly. They can walk smoothly with their grandchild at the park, right, and not have to worry that I might fall over and injure myself or injure my loved one. That's where the research is going, and it needs teams, right? It needs focused efforts of groups of people, large sources of capital to double down on singular goals to say, we're going to develop these platforms to deliver this therapy to patients. So I think we got to work closer with the research community, and not just research for research's sake, research to fix problems where we can deliver a solution not in 20 years, but in the next couple of years. And with our current state of technology and manufacturing expertise, medical device expertise, we can do that. But I think we have to reimagine a little bit how we have structured the research apparatus and the industrial apparatus around doing that sort of work.
Dr. Waziri, in your work, in the research you've done in your company, what have you seen that's out there that you've said to yourself, yep, I'm on the right path with this, and here's why?
I think there was an element of, we built the technology of our company based on decades of prior work. And so we weren't necessarily coming up with, in some settings, new information. We were just coming up with ways to actually get the information so that we could leverage the knowledge that we previously had, which we have not been able to do up to this point. But I've learned a lot about non-neurological diseases, particularly like some cardiac diseases that are being monitored with our system, seeing things that nobody's described before, which are intrinsically kind of obvious. So, for example, if you are on a therapy called ECMO, which is a version of kind of cardiopulmonary bypass that isn't necessarily involved with cardiac surgery, but it was used widely during the COVID crisis because people were having these terrible lung problems. And so we basically take the blood out of the body, oxygenate it, and put it back. People have terrible heart failure and so on and so forth. We can add pressure to that. But the major determinant of outcome in those patients is how badly injured their brain gets during that therapy. And this is something that JP and I have seen over and over and over again, is that because we don't have any information, we don't have any data about the brain in the ICU, it just gets kind of left off to the side by most intensivists. So when we're trying to figure out what blood pressure to maintain a patient at, for example, we have to give them medications to keep their blood pressure up. Well, we'll give them that medication so that the blood pressure seems like it's okay for their heart and their kidneys and their liver and so on and so forth, but it can be woefully insufficient for perfusing the brain. And we're starting to see that in the data that we're collecting. We've just never had it before. That it's totally consistent with what we would expect based on what we know about the physiology of the brain, but we've just never really looked before. And I think that's been the vision, the mission statement of our company, is to try to provide the data to the people taking care of these patients in a way that they can understand it so that they can intervene in time to avoid these problems. And just as an aside, we're collecting this data and we've got this platform that's fairly comprehensive about making it easy to use, but we have just had a quantum leap forward with the diagnostic capabilities of the large language model based AI systems. So having the data Previously the human would have to interpret the data, and there's workflow challenges and complexities. Now, with our AI companions that are going to be doing a lot of that thinking part for us, we can get back to being doctors and nurses where we're at the bedside, we're talking to the family, we're talking to the patient, we're doing like the kind of high level stuff that's more about taking care of people rather than sitting down in front of the computer and going into the medical record and trying to find the right data set. We've got to sit there and analyze it.
I think it's an exciting prospect for the younger generations thinking about careers, thinking about medicine, and maybe there's a lot of negative things they're hearing about burnout and things that take you away from the patient. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to eliminate a lot of those things that have driven some people away from medicine and bring them back in. It's going to be hopefully more about the focus of patient, more time at the bedside, a more educated conversation because there's more risk stratification with better data. There's more access to knowledge. Clinicians will be able to practice at a higher level sooner because of that access to knowledge through LLMs. We all know, and we learned a lot from those sage clinicians who've been doing it for 30 years, right? And they did their best to train that to the next generation through oral output, right? And teaching and rounds. There's an opportunity for that to happen much quicker and for younger generations, beginning clinicians to have that sage expert advice. And I think that's what Alan's trying to do as well with his system is that let's say you're at a patient, you're in an ICU in a rural ICU, you don't have neurocritical care training, but a devastated stroke patient comes in. Why not have ability to deliver that patient the same high quality of neurointensive care as the patient that happens to come to Mayo Clinic? I think that's our vision, right? That's the true way to fix equity is technology in delivering that knowledge into every single hospital in the United States. In these sorts of platforms and these brain-computer interfaces that have clinical decision support is the way to do that. So, for the younger generation, if you're listening to this podcast, I think that there's things are changing in medicine. Come back, take another look at it. And I think that you're going to be very excited about what you're going to be able to do in your future career in medicine.
Glad to hear that because, you can get lost in the technology, as you know, right? And it's amazing technology that we've been talking about during our conversation here. Dr. Waziri, Dr. Parker, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Kathy. It was a great conversation.
Thanks so much. It was fantastic.
Tomorrow's Cure is a co-production of Mayo Clinic and PRX. Our producers are Deborah Balthazar and David Newtown. The show is edited by Genevieve Sponsler. Our sound engineer is Tommy Bazarian. Our theme was composed and produced by Terrence Bernardo. Tony Carlson is our production manager, and our executive producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez. The Mayo Clinic production team includes Pui Hong Ang, Margaret Shepard, Samantha Clarkson, Kara Mangold, Felipe Sosa, Kim Ona, and Bryn Sankey. Special thanks to Preston Spire for audiovisual production support. Be sure to follow Tomorrow's Cure wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Kathy Wurzer. Thank you so much for listening.